Good morning. I'm Midshipman First Class Rory Smith, and I have the extraordinary honor to introduce this panel's topic, Machine Speed, Human Judgment, How AI is Revolutionizing Decision Dominance in Modern Warfare, and its esteemed moderator, Lieutenant General Lori Williams, United States Marine Corps, retired. General Reynolds graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1986 and commissioned as a communications officer, serving with 1st Marine Division, Marine Wing Communications Squadron 18 in Okinawa, Marine Corps Systems Command and 9th Communication Battalion, 1 MEF. She went on to command at every level, including 9th Communication Battalion during Operation Iraqi Freedom II and 1 MEF Headquarters Group during Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. As a general officer, she commanded Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island and the Eastern Recruiting Region. She served as Principal Deputy to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia and led Marine Corps Forces Cyberspace Command from 2015 to 2018. Her leadership across both operational and cyber domains makes her exceptionally well-positioned to guide what is sure to be a fascinating discussion. Today's panel will explore the forefront of artificial intelligence integration into modern warfare as real-time data processing educates and accelerates decision-making and combat readiness. This panel of experts will discuss the transformative impact of AI on military operations, as well as the key legal and ethical challenges this technology faces. Ladies and gentlemen, General Reynolds.
Thanks, Rory. All right. Good morning. You did a good job. Good morning, everybody. I think, following what I think, Ray, was a fabulous keynote, really wise choice in getting us started, talking about just the future of modern warfare, which is really what we're going to talk about here. This panel, very distinguished. I'm going to walk you through who we have here. And again, I'm hopeful for a really just fabulous conversation. When you think about, let me introduce the team, and then we'll get started. First, to my left, someone I like to call a friend. We served together when Admiral Gilday was one of the first J3s at U.S. Cyber Command, and I was at Marine Forces Cyber, and then he became Fleet Cyber before becoming the 32nd Chief of Naval Operations. But really appreciate you being willing to kind of fill in on this panel for us, Admiral Gilday, and it's wonderful to see you again. As you can imagine, his career has spanned. He's done everything that one would imagine that you would need to do to become the Chief of Naval Operations, with his strategy being, warfighters, warfighting, and the future Navy. And so he's well equipped, I think, to talk about AI vis-a-vis the future Navy. So, Admiral Gilday, thank you very much for being with us here. To his left is Dr. Michael Horowitz, who's the director of Perry Worldhouse and the Richard Perry Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the Senior Fellow for Technology and Innovation at the Council on Foreign Relations. But from 22 to 24, Dr. Horowitz served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities. He continues to write as a fellow on, technology and AI and innovation. He's got a couple books out, The Diffusion of Military Power, and he's co-authored Why Leaders Fight. So, Dr. Horowitz, thank you for joining us and being part of this panel. To his left, my friend, Lieutenant General Jack Shanahan. When I was in my senior billet as a three-star as a Deputy Commandant for Information, Jack was standing up the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, right? Our first real kind of organized approach to kind of getting the department ready for AI. And hard thing to kind of turn the Pentagon and to kind of think differently. And maybe we can talk about some of the challenges that we had during that time, Jack, and how you continue to think about that. But Jack, again, variety of operational and staff positions as a navigator, an intelligence professional. He was the first director of the Algorithmic Warfare Team, which is Project Maven, which if any of you are tracking the really first instance of successful AI integration, it was through Maven, and so Jack has the history on that as well. And so today he is affiliated with the Special Competitive Studies Project, which I think is doing fabulous work on all kinds of technology, and he's an adjunct senior fellow with technology and national security program at the Center for New American Security. So Jack, thank you for being here. And then to his left, Dr. Wendell Wallach, who has an international reputation as an expert on ethics and governance of emerging technologies, particularly AI and biotechnology. He was the Carnegie Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, where he founded and co-directed the AI and Equality Initiative. And he's also a senior advisor to the Hastings Center and a scholar at the Yale University Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, where he chaired technology and ethics studies for 11 years. So a fabulous set of experts. And my job here is to just steer the conversation. We're going to talk, folks, until about 10:30 or so, and then so get your questions ready. Hopefully some of what we talk about will provoke, your questions. I'll just start, to set the battle space here, and then I'm going to turn it over for some opening comments. But, as I think about AI and its ability to create revolution and how we fight and how we think, I think about it from the perspective of people, process, and technology. And what has to change as we think about it from that construct? What about AI makes us think differently about people? Where can AI replace people so that we can repurpose them somewhere else? Where do we need different skills? I heard somebody say one time that with AI, even your earliest, think about the recruits, the seamen, the lance corporals in the Marine Corps, they have to have supervisory capabilities, something that we haven't thought about, right? So everyone needs to have supervisory skills. What skills can be replaced with AI, and how do we repurpose? From a process perspective, I think about things like, are we even organized right in the department for the governance, development, and maintenance of AI? Do we even have that right? And then there's all of the questions that hopefully we'll hear from Dr. Wallach about ethics and the legality, and when do you just turn AI over, and when must there be a human on the loop? And then finally, the tech itself. Do we have the technology foundation that is essential? And then if we're just dreaming, what does right look like with respect to kind of cloud at the edge to enable the kinds of things that we'd love to do in this precision strike regime that we just heard this morning. So I'll stop talking. Hopefully we'll get to some of these issues. But Jack, I'm gonna ask you to start with any more on your bio or any opening comments about AI.
Well, thanks, Lori, and thanks everybody for being part of this morning. I thought I'd start with my own assessment. It's my own assessment, that's all it is, of where the department is right now in its objective to adopt AI in speed and scale. And this is 8.5 years after Project Maven started up. That's a long time. Because we're at the Naval Academy, I thought I would give it a grade. C+, GPA 2.5. What does that mean? You're going to graduate, but you're not going to be the valedictorian. There are some serious limitations. And why are they? There's myriad reasons. And I will be optimistic. There are success stories in each of the military services right now, and I hope we get to talk a little bit more about each of those. But in terms of why it's not farther along than it is, I'm going to just give you 3 quick ones. Governance, funding, digital modernization. What do I mean by governance? The department has not yet figured out how to find and strike and sustain the right balance between centralized direction and enabling functions and decentralized implementation experimentation. It's very hard to do. You can be over-centralized and you will stifle innovation. Anybody who's been in the Pentagon knows that can happen very quickly. But if you don't have any, you'll have what happened in Ukraine. The people that are fighting the war in Ukraine right now have admitted they had no choice at the beginning. Fully decentralized fight. Every unit fighting for itself, in essence. And now saying, we've got to figure out how to do more centralized piece of this because we've got to keep this innovation going if and when the fight actually ends. That balance is really hard to do. The reason we stood up the Joint AI Center after Project Maven was the services weren't going fast enough on AI, and we were getting the hell kicked out of us by everybody. So let's come up with something. Let's give the enabling functions. Let's give the policies. Let's give the test and evaluation harness, all those things that had to be done, and jump on board. I would say, again, my opinion, moving the Chief Digital and AI Office, which was the successor to the JAIC, under the Research and Engineering Division of the Department of Defense is a mistake. It conflates AI now and AI next. It puts it with a research imprimatur, and it doesn't need that. This should be about getting capabilities to the combatant commands, the military services, much faster than it is today. So I'm not optimistic about that. I hope to be proven wrong. But you take something out from the number 2 person in the department and you put it under R&E, it sends a signal to the rest of the force. There are different reasons that it happened. I get that, but that's a signal. Second is the funding. Anybody who's ever been in the Pentagon knows, how do you assess how a project is doing? Follow the money. AI is woefully underfunded to a factor of about 10x right now, maybe even 20x. We talk a big game, the talking points, the rhetoric is all good, it's all there. But when you follow the trail of money, it's just not sufficient to do what the department needs to do to bring this at scale. And I'll always come back to scale. So those are, to me, the 2 biggest ones. And then the third one, the last one, digital modernization. I will bastardize an aphorism about logistics. Amateurs talk technology, professionals talk digital modernization. We love the technologies, we're enamored with it. But unless we fix the underlying infrastructure and architecture of the Department of Defense and all the data strategies that actually have to be followed as opposed to just thrown out there, we're in trouble. It's not going to happen nearly fast enough. Every commercial company that was like the Defense Department and born in the industrial age as a hardware company is struggling to figure out how to become a software company in the digital age. It's an extraordinarily difficult job to do it. I know this. I'm not saying from anything, but I got a lot of things wrong in Project Maven and JAIC. But I understand what it takes to get there. We have to invest much, much more in getting the underlying infrastructure and the data strategy right. So I give it a C+. I would love to say it's not that bad, but I'm not going to be overly optimistic because I don't see the signs of the evidence of progress that's fast enough right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Jack. Dr. Horowitz, how about you?
I mean, the tough thing about going after Jack is especially when he takes the good lines, I have to think on the fly about what to say myself. Just in that I don't know about whether C+ is quite the right grade or not. Actually, I'd be curious what everybody's grades, frankly, for this would be. There are some, I think, green shoots, I would say, but the core message I would give you is the exact same, which is that people worry a lot about AI. I mean, if you can't, if you pull out your phone and search for something about artificial intelligence, you can't help but trip over varieties of doomsaying about AI. Whether that is true out there in the commercial world is a different question, but from a Pentagon perspective, the far greater risk is going too slowly rather than too quickly. And I think we see this in a bunch of different ways. So the first I'll talk about is with regard to weapon systems. While I was in the Pentagon, we updated DoD Directive 3000.09, autonomy in weapon systems, otherwise known as DoD's killer robots policy. And an important thing about that in the context of debates about AI, you often hear people talk about how, there's always going to be a human in the loop. We have to keep a human in the loop, et cetera, et cetera. If you actually read DoD policy on autonomy and weapon systems, the phrase "in the loop" does not appear. It is not part of DoD policy. There is no requirement that a human be in the loop, any more so than after a soldier fires a bullet, that there needs to be a human walking the bullet to the target. But for some reason, we have convinced ourselves of this, maybe because we like OODA loops and we think they're cool, maybe because we're trying to reassure ourselves about the prominence of humans. What there is a requirement for human responsibility and accountability over the use of force. And so I worry that the use of the loop phrasing has taken us off track, which I saw when I talked to every military service, and in all of them I was like, we can't build that because there wouldn't be a human in the loop. What are you talking about? You have to pull out the policy and actually show them. And because it was the Pentagon, of course, we printed it. And this is illustrative, I think, of the broader challenge. It's not unique to the United States in this context, and it's not unique to this particular period of history. If you think back to the keynote and other stuff that Andy K has written over the years. That's sort of thing one. Thing two, that I would say is there is an urgent need to scale capabilities that are ready. There's often a temptation, I think, when it comes to emerging capabilities to make the perfect the enemy of the good. And that was especially the case in the context where we thought that the kinds of wars we were most likely to fight were wars against outmatched adversaries that didn't necessarily have sophisticated technologies and where we could simply overwhelm them. And so having small numbers of exquisite capabilities was not just good enough, but was what we wanted. Launch one missile, one hit, game over. In today's military world, where every actor around the world now has access to precision strike capabilities because it's now generations old, we have entered the era of precise mass in war, which means that AI dominance will become central in having better control of your systems, better orchestration of your systems, and also needing more systems. And that in a new era of mass, it will be AI that helps determine whether we succeed or fail in a critical factor, and whether we succeed or fail. And so AI leadership is nothing about that is about a large language model or frontier AI or artificial general intelligence or some like super fancy stuff. This is frankly like the AI of 5 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. We have still not scaled that in the context of the joint force in some ways because of the way that the joint force remains so focused on small numbers of exquisite systems. The more we can scale precise mass using AI that's ready today, the better, which is consistent with Jack's point about thinking about AI not just as a research and development exercise, but as something that is ready now. The third thing that I'll say is I think no military has better policies in the world to responsibly integrate AI than the United States military. Every single United States military policy on artificial intelligence and the governance of artificial intelligence is publicly available, which is why our policies are also the most criticized in the world. Countries that don't do that, China, Russia, many potential American adversaries. And I think that transparency is a strength and frankly has led to lots of engagement and interaction with Jack in sort of his old role, with me when I was in the Pentagon, with lots of others, in ways that frankly have iteratively improved our ability to ensure that when we're ready, that our policies are there and responsibly ready once we do a lot of the things that Jack just mentioned. And let me stop there.
Thanks. Dr. Wallach.
Well, thank you. I am truly honored to be here today. The last time I was here was actually a similar event. I think it was roughly 12 years ago. And it was war games, looking at emerging technologies and what their impact would be on politics, on military affairs, on ethics, and on governance. I came with absolutely no claim for any expertise about military affairs at all. In fact, I've never served. But I was there because by that time I had a reputation for having expertise in emerging technologies and in their governance. And it's a kind of transdisciplinary expertise. So it delved into so many different areas. And one of the things that sort of I couldn't avoid was what the ramifications would be for the military domain, what the ramifications would be of biological weapons or biological organisms that had been artificially manufactured for geopolitics. So that was my reason for being there, but by that time I had already made certain declarations related to the military domain. For example, I had stated that a machine making life and death decisions about humans is mala in se. For those of you who don't know the Latin term, it means evil in itself. And that's an example of that would be rape. Rape would be something that is evil in itself. does not need to be explained. Now, that was a controversial statement. Not everybody agreed with it, and we've been debating it ever since. But that was one of the statements and factors that led to what became the campaign to regulate, if not ban, internationally lethal autonomous weapon systems. Those of you who have been following that debate for the last 15 years or so understand what a complicated debate it is, because we're talking about technologies that have both benefits and that have potential harms. And the question is whether we can have the benefits and manage the potential harms, whether we can diffuse the benefits and manage the potential harms. And we're still exploring that today, and I think for me at least, that's where I'm coming from in what contribution as a non-military person I can make to the conversation we're having today. But let me just quote for a minute from one of my colleagues, Anya Kasperson, who said, "Are new technologies in warfare making war more humane or more brutal? As we integrate AI into the battlefield, are we reinforcing ethical constraints, or are we enabling a kind of violence that is further removed from human empathy and moral reflection?" That's a question for you all. That is not a settled question. But the answers to those questions will have an awful lot to do with what unfolds from here on. Whether militaries such as the US really deploy AI in a responsible manner, or whether, as if we're in the rating systems of what's C+, my rating system is more about, are we on the correct trajectory with AI? And I would be hard-pressed to give it a C+. Not that there aren't benefits out there, but there are some serious deficits, and there's a lack of oversight and governance. Now, 12 years ago or so, there was very little AI, as Jack can attest for you. And certainly we didn't have deep learning, we didn't have generative AI, we didn't have all these breakthroughs we've seen since. But now we are in the beginning of that era where we do see AI on the battlefield. So any of you, or hopefully all of you, know these words: lavender, the gospel, where's daddy? These are 3 decision support systems that Israel deployed in Gaza. And they are about who may or may not be in Hamas, where are they? So at some point it may have been tracking 27,000 or more citizens in Gaza. What buildings had they gone into, which was being tracked, the activities in those buildings by the gospel? And are they in those buildings, and should we target those buildings? Now, ostensibly in the future, all 3 of these programs will be put together. But at the moment, they did stand as 3 different programs. And to maintain human in the loop, or at least the illusion of human in the loop, the recommendations for targeting were passed on to military advisors, many of whom said they had roughly 20 seconds to make that decision. Furthermore, in 20 seconds, they didn't really know whether the software knew who was in Hamas and who was not in Hamas. They didn't know how many civilians were in each of those buildings, but they had been given pretty high thresholds for proportionality. So this is my second concern here. Will AI support really be AI support, or will AI support be AI decision-making? And that plays into the third area, the speed of warfare itself, the way in which artificial intelligence is making things faster and faster. But it's not just artificial intelligence, but clearly artificial intelligence is a key factor in that. And this again goes back to a recommendation which probably is 15, 20 years old, because in the early days, the imagination about AI in warfare was largely around drones, and was around the notion of robots on the battlefield. Well, robots on the battlefield are going to be a lot quicker, as Andrew alluded to in his opening comments, than soldiers are going to be. In fact, early research by Benjamin Libet suggests that it takes roughly 350 milliseconds for a human to decide when to act, and another 250 milliseconds, roughly a quarter of a second, to actually act. Technology moves much more quickly than that. We are talking in nanoseconds, not in milliseconds, when we talk about processing power. So are we going to be at a distinct disadvantage on the battlefield or in our jet fighters? And will we have to turn over the decision-making authority to the machines? I'm afraid that's the direction we're headed in. Good news is we aren't anywhere near that yet. But that is deeply problematic, not for just the battlefield, but for humanity as a whole. Whether we are moving in a direction where we will lose control of the technology. And to lose control does not require any advanced superintelligence or artificial general intelligence. It just requires abrogating authority because we cannot act quickly enough. So one last thing for all of that, and that's, it's problematic whether AI will be good or bad. It's problematic whether we can or should restrict it. Human in the loop is probably a misnomer in terms of how the affairs of warfare are conducted. But that doesn't obviate the question of whether the AI we are deploying is an extension of human will and intention, or is capable of acting autonomously and independently? And if so, will it make errors? For sure. But will it act in ways we could not have anticipated? For sure.
Okay, thanks. Admiral Gilday, sir, in your position as a service chief and now the CEO of Crossover Solutions, sir, what are your thoughts?
First, I'd like to thank Admiral Spicer and your team and the dozens of invisible hands that it took to put on today's event and the cadence of events that you conduct continuously. Thank you very, very much. I'll preface my comments by saying I believe that we're still in the opening innings of AI, despite the fact that, it's been 8.5 years since Jack did all that incredible work with Maven. And so I'd like to touch on 2 points that others have talked more deeply about. One is governance, and the second is the point that you mentioned on people. And so with respect to governance, I am influenced by the last 1.5 years or so that I've spent in industry, particularly in manufacturing, in all kinds of companies, from die casting and forging. That technology goes back to the Philistines, all the way to AI-powered robotics with 1,500 robots on a shop floor pushing out components of Waymo taxis. And the thing that strikes me about all of those components that come together to push, let's say, an F-150 off the line every 57 seconds is an underlying or an overarching governance framework that allows those manufacturers to have very close contact and oversight on their supply chains. And a lot of that's fueled, right, by data. A lot of that oversight function is fueled by data, and a lot of that data is manipulated by some type of AI capability. The U.S. banking system, and General Reynolds works with U.S. Bank, they similarly have very high-tech AI-powered processes that they use. My point is that there are governance structures out there that we can learn from, and elements of which we should convey over to the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the larger defense industrial base. The second point I'd like to make is on people, and again, back to the opening innings piece of this, and stepping away from the automaticity of AI to how do we collaborate more closely with AI? Can we, as an example, provide an AI coach for every midshipman at the Naval Academy or every recruit at Parris Island in Great Lakes? And that AI tutor would help them not only professionally in their occupational specialties to hone their skills in terms of continuous learning, but also help in areas like leadership and help them in perhaps in war fighting, and to make them more critical thinkers, and to give them that AI coach that would follow them not only during their time in the military, but also as they transition into civilian life. A friend of mine who is the CEO of an AI company, he has his own AI agent that AI tutor that he calls Claude. He's got his own MCP server dedicated to Claude. Claude helps him write his emails. It generates his morning reports on how his company is operating. And I'm just fascinated by that thought that each of us could benefit by that kind of capability. Likewise, I would think that in our war games, as we do a move, we would no longer just have generals and admirals and colonels and captains, thinking about how we're going to move pieces on a chessboard. They make that move, but then we play that against an AI model or perhaps in some type of simulation algorithm that runs it 1,000 times. And we learn from each other, right? And I think because at the end of the day, and Einstein said this, imagination is more important than knowledge, that knowledge is finite. It's limited to what we know and understand. And he described imagination as, circling the earth, as infinite. And when you think about the U.S. sailor, the U.S. Marine, the adapt and overcome kind of mentality, it's that kind of creativity that allows us to adapt and overcome. And AI can be helpful in that way to make us even better.
Thanks, Admiral.
Sure.
I forgot to say happy birthday to the Navy. So
Thank you.
now that that's done, we can talk about the Marine Corps birthday. But, okay, Jack.
Yeah.
Jack and Mike, I'm coming at you with, what can you say about how AI is currently being integrated into C2 systems and operational planning, and are there any early lessons learned?
Yeah, so really, this point about being in the first inning is so incredibly important, and not to draw out the sports analogies too much, but look at Coach K and Dean Smith's records in their first season. They were not undefeated in the first season. Neither is Bill Belichick, by the way. I'm coming from down in North Carolina. What matters most, and this is really driven home by what's going on in Ukraine right now, I'll use 3 words: agility, adaptability, and ingenuity. That's, as we used to say in Project Maven, we were never going to innovate with Project Maven. It wouldn't come from the Pentagon. That's an oxymoron. But what we want to do is get the user involved as quickly as possible, push minimum viable product due to them, let them tear it apart, what worked, what didn't work, how do we make it better? And a very rapid continuous integration, continuous deployment cycle. Never got it nearly fast enough compared to commercial industry, but it was light speed back then for the department. So today, I still look at the one program that I can say is scaled to the point that we always wanted to is Project Maven. Many of the things we did in the Joint AI Center have not, other than they've kind of disappeared below the radar. They're there, but not at that scale. Maven's being used globally. It's being used in support of operations in Ukraine. Palantir, being very business savvy, calls it the Maven Smart System. They were there at the beginning with us. And it's not just the NGA version of Project Maven, it's the 18th Airborne Corps. It's CENTCOM's Task Force 59. Some of the most innovative work that I've seen coming out on these projects has been in places like CENTCOM, driven by the urgency of the environment. But there are other things going in the services. As I said at the beginning, this is not all bad news. There's really good things happening. CDAO was running something called GUIDE, the Global Information Dominance Experiment. They did Task Force Lima. The Navy, Project Ammo, fantastic program. How do you deliver AI models, updated models, to a UUV that's submerged? Turns out that's a pretty challenging process. And the PEO, IWS in the Navy, I love what they're doing. They got the big program of record. We all know how cumbersome, bureaucratic that is. But within that, they've kind of got this very agile, adaptive loop going where they put updates onto SM6 and Aegis systems. That is a great example. Each of the services has something. Linchpin, convergence. With the Air Force, it was called ABMS for a while. I don't think they use that as much, but generally I would say Joint Fires Network, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. I think what we're going to see and hope we're going to see, it's no longer AI for AI's sake, but AI embedded in these systems. The sign of success for me is when this is put into the PEOs and the SPOs, the Program Executive Offices, System Program Offices, and it just becomes part of digital modernization. Yes, technology is going to outpace everything. You're going to have to eventually add something on that we almost call a bolt-on. But if you have the digital practices correct, that is infinitely easier to do than what we were trying to do with Maven. It put this into a program of record that was never designed for this. It was hard, it didn't work very well, and you inevitably plateau. So I think there are examples in each one of the services that are doing well, but they do have to have the attention to allow them to scale to the size of the DoD. The combatant commands should be able to go into a marketplace and say, that's the model I need for this. That's the data I need for that. Give me that. All of that is nowhere close to happening yet. It was always the vision, but a lot more work to be done, has to be done in that area. So my C+ is caveated. We are early in this game, but it requires really focused attention from the very top with a mandate. We do this right or we lose the next war.
I think that those are great points, and to build on them, and it gets back to something you said about sort of management and organization. In some ways, note that when Jack was talking about what implementation of these systems actually look like, he was talking about the combatant commands, but the programs are all in the different services. And a fundamental tension with scaling AI right now, especially for decision support in varieties, especially in the combatant commands, is the fundamental way that the structure of Pentagon budgeting works, where the services man, train, and equip, and the combatant commands actually own the forces. And what we're talking about is scaling an integrated set of software where each of the services has a piece of it fundamentally to give, say, a combatant commander an AI-enabled single pane of glass or whatever the current trendy phrase is to look at the world. There's a mismatch between what the integration that we want for the joint force at the combatant command level, and then the way that the money has to run to actually scale those AI programs, which involves the service level. And there's been some work to try to fix that with, say, something like the Joint Fires Network, but this is a fundamental challenge to the organization that is not just an AI challenge, to be clear. This is an issue that would exist in this era of warfare regardless of AI. But it's a fundamental organizational question that I think we haven't necessarily figured out yet. And so that's thing one. And then thing two, and I will stop, is that I think that the way I think about this in the context of how we're doing with AI integration for something like C2 is we will have succeeded when we no longer need AI offices anymore. And here's what I mean by that. I think about AI as a general purpose technology, so something like, say, electricity. There was no electricity arms race, just like I don't think there's an AI arms race. And there also there wasn't necessarily a big War Department electricity office that existed for 50 years to ensure that every part of the military was electrified. Instead, you have, as electricity diffuses and is adopted throughout society and the military applications of electricity become clear, every military mission incorporates electricity. And that then leads to lots of different types of military capabilities. Success will be when we see the same thing in AI, and it's something like the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center or CDAO, et cetera, isn't necessary because it's fundamentally part of how every office in the military does business and thinks about developing and fielding capabilities, and we're just not there yet.
So as we continue to scale and we begin to get to see the day where AI is firmly integrated into all of our operations, how do we think about ensuring that human judgment, Wendell, you've talked about this already this morning, how do we make sure that human judgment remains at the center of those critical military decisions? And so, Wendell, we'll start with you, and then Admiral Gildea, I'd appreciate your thoughts on that as well.
Well, I think this has already been alluded to throughout this morning, going back to our opening keynote, and that's that this is an inflection point. It's not just a question of integrating AI into the existing military, but it's actually that these technologies are going to force a transformation of the military itself. And as Andrew said this morning, some of the branches may not be as important in the world we're creating. We're moving into very different environments. And we're moving into very different challenges for us as human beings. It's not just AI in the military or other emerging technologies, but it's climate change. It's the fact that we're in a period where our fundamental institutions are being transformed, perhaps undermined, perhaps redirected. And we are all going to be in these positions of making decisions about whether human judgment continues to be a valuable resource, or whether we're going to defer to the judgment of others or the judgment of machines, or only those humans, those elites, who are working together with the machines. Now, from an ethical viewpoint, there is a framework for this, at least in the military context, but also more broadly. There's international humanitarian law. And I've been heartened throughout my lifetime to watch the American military evolve from one where everything was command and control to that even the lowest soldier had the right to refuse a command if they perceived it as violating human rights and international humanitarian law. Now, not everybody seems to understand what international humanitarian law is. In fact, Zed Husseini, who's been one of the leading forces internationally on human rights, said Americans don't always want to acknowledge that international humanitarian law exists. But that's the law of armed conflict, laws that have been put in place to diffuse, particularly in the wartime context, the impact of warfare on civilians. Over the last decade or so, everybody has been giving obeisance internationally to IHL, to the laws of armed conflict. They've been giving obeisance to arguments about the need for meaningful human control in the deployment of artificial intelligence, to maintain human judgment within the decision-making process. But in both Ukraine and in Gaza, we've seen that those words are pretty empty. The violations of international humanitarian law and human rights are self-evident. International humanitarian law states that proportionality and distinction between civilians and non-combatants is essential. And yet in Gaza, the proportionality that was being used gave value to 15 humans, 15 non-combatants for every low-level Hamas fighter or perceived Hamas fighter, and 150 civilians for every high-level Hamas fighter. That's not a form of proportionality that seems to me is either ethical or following international humanitarian law. And so I think that's still a foundation for us. International humanitarian law, human rights, minimize the harms you have to do. That has to find its integration into the way decision-making is made in the military, and it has to find its way in where we do not defer to machines which make errors, very different errors than human beings, but they certainly make errors, some of which can be catastrophic, even giving rise to new conflicts. Machines that are largely statistical, stochastic decision makers. Machines that don't have all the information any more than we do, and certainly don't understand many of the fundamental things about the harms being caused in warfare that each of us understands. So I think keeping humans in the loop, or at least keeping humans central to the decision-making process, is our commitment to that. This has very little to do with the machines themselves. It has to do with whether we are committed enough to that or we are going to abrogate responsibility and authority by deferring to the machines themselves.
I guess I would argue just one thought, and I'll toss this over to the experts here, but I mean, we are still who we are as American military, right? That doesn't change with a tool.
No.
Our tool is only as good as what we demand of it, right? And so if the tools used in Gaza were inappropriate for the standard that we have as the American military, it seems to me that you need to fix the tool. But Admiral Gilday, your thoughts?
So your question really focused on the lethal use of force.
That's right,
And
sir.
AI. And so we're not doing a lunar landing here. To your point, we've been here before with automation. And I think that one of there has to be key principles that are set forth in the department. One of them is technical reliability. And that's grounded on rigorous testing and certification of not only the systems, but the people that are going to touch them. And so operators and systems need to be certified. Rigorous testing needs to be an absolute principle that we adhere to. And the piece that you talked about, Wendell, I think, and you also spoke to, I think the overarching framework in terms of the use in combat is grounded on rules of engagement. And so those rules of engagement are going to help a commander make a decision on the degree of automation that he's going to use. He absolutely has to be biased towards not harming civilians, as an example, causing no harm. And so that's going to be part of that calculus within those rules of engagement in the employment of those systems, whether there's a person actually flipping the switch or whether it's done using AI. So I don't think that changes.
Yeah. Dr. Horowitz, you're shaking your head. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, even if you take what Wendell said at sort of face value about how Israel was making decisions, say about the use of force, that sounds to me like a rules of engagement issue, not a technology issue. And in some ways, I don't want to be in a situation where we eliminate responsibility from the human. The most important thing that I think we can do to ensure in some ways, strong compliance with international humanitarian law, which I think is in our interest to be a lethal warfighting organization, is to have humans always being in charge of decisions and being accountable. And so I would want no situations in which we blame the AI. In some ways, those are people making decisions, and that has to be. And we have the best people in the world. And so that is a situation that I think will benefit the American military.
Okay.
Can I weigh in on this?
Sure.
I think you are the U.S. military, and you have a certain ethical obligation to ensure U.S. readiness. But I think the deep problematic here is we're no longer in a world where it's just the U.S. military. We're in a world where there's, particularly between the U.S. and China, a constant ratcheting up of tension. And that ratcheting up becomes almost automatic. They do something, we respond, and there's a question about how much human decision-making really comes in if that's our response. Secondly, in spite of the fact that some of the militaries of the world, like the U.S., are very committed to the protecting of civilians, we've got a lot of other militaries that aren't. And that's going to force us over and over again into the decision, well, if they're going to do it, don't we have to? And I think that's a fundamental question that we have to dig deeply on. Do we always have to be in a dominant position? And if so, will we always do it regardless of the ethics of what we're responding to? Or can we be a little bit more creative in this generation and evaluate whether that if they do it doesn't necessarily means we have to do the same thing, that we can find other means, if not diffusing conflict, at least pursuing conflict in a more ethical manner.
So in essence, I think we have this, really what we're talking about is the difference between the opportunity of AI in improving the speed and the decision. By the way, we haven't talked yet about how AI improves our decision making, right? Or the fact that AI can reduce collateral damage to civilians or give us greater precision. So that's the opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's only as good as what we demand of it, I think. And Jack, you've dealt with so many of these vendors. I'd appreciate your thoughts on, how are they thinking about? Is it harder to deal with the U.S. military than it is to deal with the Israeli military? I don't know, but it's interesting. What are we demanding of the tools? But then there's the risk, right, of like over dependence, perhaps. But I think I have not heard, at least in any of my discussions, about kind of removing the human element of decision making or the rules of engagement. Jack, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a question of, so there's so much of what Wendell said I agree with philosophically, but in a practical matter, I am of the belief that having spent my 36 years in the military, I'm actually more confident in the ability of our people to adapt over time to new technologies. I have lots of examples from my own background, getting in the airplane and go and turn that switch on, the thing dives and flies 300 feet above the ground at night, hands off. I go, okay, how do we get that confidence in that system? There's a test and evaluation piece. There's a rules of engagement on the kinetic piece of it. So there is a process to do this. We actually, before I retired, we got the secretary to sign out the DoD AI ethics principles. They exist today. They exist in principle, but they also have to then be applied in implementation. That was a new conversation for contractors to say, well, what do you mean responsible, equitable, reliable, traceable, and governable? Remember them now like I did 6 years ago, whatever it was. That's the hard part of this, but there has to be an ongoing discussion. 3000.09, which Mike referred to, there is a senior level review process mandated in there, once before development, once before fielding. In that process, you ought to be, our senior leaders must be asking those hard questions. How's this supposed to work? What if it fails? What's the worst case? What's the best case? And so on. I do think, to Wendell's point, we should be very, very wary about fielding things for the first time in combat. We ought to be experimenting, wargaming with them, trying them out, doing test and evaluation. I do not want any commander to be put in the position for the first time saying, well, I hope it works. I've been in that position with special projects in my past, and commanders rightfully kicked it out of the room and said, I've never seen that before, don't give that to me. So we need to put much more attention. And I think there is one piece that I will come down much more on the side of Wendell, is saying emergent behavior and unknown properties of online learning systems. If these systems really get so advanced that they're capable of making life and death decisions by themselves without human intervention, that's a different world. I think what Mike and I have talked about, he says that's what you're supposed to find in test and evaluation. I agree with that, but I just wonder if these things are going to become so advanced, we may miss some of these capabilities to a point. But if that happens, I also say we have a long track record of saying, stop. Who's responsible? Let's hold back a little bit. Let's retest them. What did we get wrong? And we do 15-6 investigations. We do look to hold people accountable. We haven't always done it in the most purest sense, but that is our baseline of accountability responsibilities fall on humans, not software developers, not commercial companies, humans.
Jack, what you're talking about really is maintaining trust, right? With all of the various stakeholders that, as a member of the DoD, our job is to maintain the trust of the American people, those that we serve with, and so forth. Admiral Gilday, your thoughts on that?
So trust is grounded on repeatable, predictable behavior. And you really need to have some type of governance structure that takes into account the technical reliability piece that I mentioned, clear governance and accountability. So if anything, as we talked this morning, we talk more about human AI interaction than not,
Yeah.
and the importance of that, the importance of being comfortable with it, to testing it, right? To essentially having hands-on, right, where it becomes an extension of yourself in a sense. I think that there has to be rigorous testing and evaluation. There has to be, as I mentioned before, certification of not only AI software, but also the people that are going to touch it, operate it, and be responsible for employing it. I think there needs to be some type of audit process and traceability of those ones and zeros, just like the U.S. banking system has, right? You all conduct banking online. You hit the I believe button that your metadata is not going to be exposed. And we need that same type of level of integrity in those systems as well. And the ones and zeros need to be able to be traced. And there needs to be some type of accounting of that on a regular basis. And there needs to be transparency in terms of how we talk to our forces about this and to the public in terms of what we're doing in terms of those, 1 to N things I mentioned to make sure that there's trust and to build that trust by talking about it transparently in forums like this.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, let me weigh in on that because I think in going down this AI road, repeatable and predictable is far from guaranteed. In fact, it's almost guaranteed that it won't be always repeatable, it won't be predictable. And yet a lot of the tools we're talking about today probably will be. They're low-level AI. They aren't going to be predictable in the sense that we know exactly what their output's going to be, but that's why we value them. They're going to bring to our attention factors that we may not be looking at otherwise. But we may also be aware of context-specific factors that the AI system is not. But as Jack alluded to, as we move into learning systems, then they become systems that can change their own parameters. And they become less and less predictable. But it's not just learning systems. The systems we have today, even the generative AI systems, their inputs are changing at a rapid pace. And with new inputs, you're going to get new outputs. And are you going to test these systems day in and day out so that you can have assured trust in their predictability, or at least that they will stay within safe parameters? What we do not have today is appropriate guardrails. We have failed viciously in the safety and security of the AI systems that are out there. That doesn't mean they've been deployed by the military in any harmful way yet, but that's the fact of the systems that we have at this point. And if they start becoming more and more introduced into military activities, then the likelihood of an unpredictable event that may even be a low probability event but has a very high impact goes up significantly.
Okay. I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'm going to open it up to whomever from the audience or virtual world has some questions. So, Michael, I'm going to come to you. What are the most important priorities you think the U.S. and our allies may have for AI to maintain a decisive edge?
I think in some ways it actually gets to an intersection of what all 3 panelists said, although Wendell might not like the outcome, which is that if you want Admiral Gilday or Lieutenant General Shanahan to, in their old roles to feel comfortable pressing the I believe button and actually deploying a system, you need trust and confidence in it. You need the sort of testing and evaluation done. You need training of the people that are going to operate those systems. You can't just bring it to the room the day of an operation and say hey, plug this AI widget in. Not that makes sense conceptually. I think the urgency is figuring out the AI use cases where we can scale today. Since the way to move from the abstract conversation about the sort of future of AI, like what will AI mean, to the reality of what sort of fielded on the battlefield or in the back office sort of looks like is through specific use cases. And so I think what the U.S. and its allies and partners need to be doing is ruthlessly trying to prioritize the use cases where you could scale in the shorter term, because that will also build organizational trust and confidence in those applications. Because in some ways, like in the grand scheme of things, there's certainly some ways that we would choose not to use AI, and our partners would probably choose not to use AI. There's some where we will. There's some where the technology is ready today. There's some where the technology is going to be ready 5 years from now. But at some point, we need to move out. And I think there's enough evidence from both what the U.S. has already done and some of the great work that Jack and others did, what we've seen in some of the services, what we see in Ukraine, to know in logistics, in a few very limited battlefield applications, in some decision support areas, where we can scale now and scale with our allies and partners, which will then build trust and confidence for what might be bigger moves down the road.
It seems to me that might be a helpful exercise for the department. I mean, there are places, obviously, that we're using AI right now. I mean, think about cyber defense, right? Anomaly detection, anomaly blocking, all of that is machine learning, and it
We
is.
don't call it AI then, though. Once
But
we
we
figure
need
it out,
to. We ought to just call it what it is, and so that, right, we can say, look, we can do this. Intelligence analysis. I mean, the whole intelligence cycle can be turned on its head with AI. And Jack, to your credit, you and Colonel Kukor and others who kind of made Maven happen. I watched COCOM commanders like eyes wide open about the potential that Maven provided them with intelligence tracking and all those other things and identify. So anyway, maybe there's just a need for us to kind of be a little bit more thoughtful about here's where we're using it today, in order to kind of build that trust and.
Absolutely. There's a lot of back office functions that AI can be applied to now. I would think about dual use technologies where AI is being used out in industry, and how you can bring that, whether it's HRO functions, or whether it's finances,
Acquisition
or
people.
whether it's logistics potentially. Maintenance would be another example where it's already been tested, it's being used out there, and we can adopt it. And I don't want to say completely learn on the fly, but I think that the risk is acceptable in many of those areas.
Sure.
where the department people get more comfortable with the application of it.
Sure.
And it doesn't have to necessarily be going after the most difficult problems as the priorities. You have to get to them, but.
Right. And finally, what's one misconception about AI in defense that you think deserves correction? Jack, any thoughts?
That it's further along than it really is. I say that, that's not tongue in cheek. That's true. People really do. It's a cliche by this point, but it's true. They hear AI, Pentagon, killer drones. It's just automatic. We're tainted by Hollywood, science fiction, and social media. As we just were saying just minutes ago, there's so much that's happening below all that level in what I would call almost the quotidian day administrative tasks. Just get them done. But it's still not as far along as it needs to be. And I said, in that same sentence, I would say, I still put great faith and credit in our military personnel to do this the right way, the safe, lawful, and ethical use of these technologies. It could go wrong. I don't doubt that for a second. We've done that in our history. But you set the bar very high in peacetime and do everything you can to strive to keep that.
Right. Michael?
So what do we do in the Pentagon? We write memos, and we move paper. Nobody builds anything in the Pentagon. No, you don't field weapons in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's where you move the paper to move the money so that things happen in other places. There'd be no single better unleashing of human capital than the ability of every office in the Pentagon to use like ChatGPT and equivalents, and with models that at all levels of classification that trained on libraries of memos and talking points and read aheads. And like I could think of like that, I think there'd be a 50% time saving for my old office in the Pentagon. And then the unleashing of all of those really smart people, both in uniforms or civil servants, coming in through other authorities to be able to actually use their brains then and think of creative ideas to help American national defense, if they could start with a memo that was 50% of the way done because they had access to technology that my undergraduates do at Penn.
Anyone else? Misconceptions? Any questions from the audience?
I have a question. It's an honor to be here.
Can you come to the mic because we have a virtual audience?
Midshipman First Class Boyd. It's an honor to be here in front of you, ma'am and gentlemen. My question is a bit of a two-header, and it starts off with this definition of responsibility and how we view responsibility. If us as a nation may be lacking in some areas, but we are the forebearers of what this responsibility is, that being the forebearers of democracy and what ethics is in societies. Do you think that the problem we are focusing on should be what AI could develop and become, or the people that are responsible for defining this responsibility? Which could be, you could look at it from this ethics standpoint, but you could also look at it from, it is our responsibility as a nation to not become obsolete. So what will we do with AI? And how do we put those guardrails on the people that are responsible for that? The next question is, can we claim this title of being responsible if the countries that we assist and fund and in essence create their artificial intelligence are being inhumane about the way that they use artificial intelligence? For example, going back to what we're looking at with Israel. Those are my questions.
I'll jump in first. Excellent question. Really, really, you're getting to the heart of a couple of really big points. On the second piece of the question, I will say that is really not that different than any technology that we've dealt with before. It is different, but that question is still the same question. To your first point, this is what we talked a lot about when I was in the Joint AI Center is, okay, we have these principles. How do we then talk with companies who are building these technologies to put them into practice? It's almost a continuous do loop here where how does the technology act in responsible ways? Well, the machine are being designed by humans. Who should? You'll hear these terms. I don't know if you're in the robotics program here, but you may not have heard of these terms. There are things that are being talked about like ethical by design or ethics principles, ethics by design, responsible by design, legal by design. I think that's a little bit of struggle. Wendell's probably a little bit more pessimistic than I am on this, but interesting to hear his point, is we should be looking at this from the very beginning. My point is I don't use the word loop anymore. I say there will always be a version of human control. The question is where, when, and how does that human control get applied? I think it's going to be further and further left. I know it's going to be further and further left, which means we have to think much more carefully during the design and development phase of doing what you just said. How do we do this in a way that these systems will be used in ways that are safe, lawful, and ethical? We have some pretty good ideas about how to do that, but I think it's more of an open field right now than anything else. We have to do a lot of playing around with this to say, is that okay in this context of the Taiwan Strait? Unacceptable in a Fallujah environment where there's civilians by the thousand. So there's always going to be a contextual piece of this in the military, just the way we do operations. But we also have to account for this technology can be applied in any of those contexts. So do we have to retrain it? Do we have to do something differently? So it really is, the answer to your question is we need to spend more time thinking about how we actually develop and design these systems, because the human's going to be in a different place. Machines go wrong in the airplane, we are there to fix it, pull the circuit breaker, do whatever it is. May not have that opportunity once that weapon is gone. So that's my part of the answer.
Let me jump in. I also love the question, and I think the first one is a great question, and I don't think we are going to answer it on this panel, because that's a question for you and the entire military for a lifetime. I'm not so much a pessimist as I am somebody who sees the problematics, and I don't see the work being done yet to ensure the safety and security of these systems. These systems aren't totally transparent, and that opens the door for people to defer responsibility when they deploy the system. I never knew it could do that. Or we have no way of assessing why what went wrong. Now, you have heard calls from all the panelists here for us to do the hard work, to see whether we can master the problem of transparency, whether we can do a forensic analysis of why things went wrong with AI systems so we don't repeat that. But at the moment, we don't really have those tools. And yet, at least in the domestic realm, we have the development and deployment of systems at an unbelievable rate without the appropriate safeguards in place. So being responsible is that you take on responsibility for deploying the system, that you do everything in your power to understand how it may or may not be, behave, and take on the responsibility if things go wrong. One of the concerns I've had over my relatively long lifetime now is that I've seen a dilution of responsibility in the U.S. military. I've seen too many incidences where events happen, going back to, what was he, Major Calley during the Vietnam War, where tragedies have happened, and yet there was not enough holding people accountable for their actions. That would be a disaster in the era of AI.
I think the short answer to your question is that the people are always more important than the tool. And it is the people that make the tool what it needs to be. And if we are going to lead with values, as our country has always done in the past, then the people matter more than anything. So, and that includes who we choose as our allies and close partners and so forth. And so you're asking all the right questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Keep
gentlemen.
our honor clean, don't we?
We have to keep our honor clean. There's in a song about that somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Midshipman First Class Chad Bowe. So, Lieutenant General Shanahan, earlier you mentioned that it will be difficult to implement AI without investing into the underlying infrastructure to make it possible. Now, obviously, I'll preface my question by saying recently the U.S. government has invested into Intel, to obviously accelerate semiconductors. The Department of War has entered a private stake into MP materials for critical minerals. And is there a chance that the Department of War would do the same thing with perhaps a public AI infrastructure company that might have software computing and GPUs available? And what might be the implications of such action?
Yeah, thanks. Again, I'll use a cliche here on sports. It is really blocking and tackling. It is the fundamentals that people just find. I'll tell you my example is everybody loves talking about AI. The first time they actually try to do a project and run into the data challenge, they give up in frustration. There was a Marine Corps colonel who would never take no for an answer. We just plowed through problem after problem after problem. This was the challenge, was what's behind the scenes. Not that my boss, when I was at the Joint AI Center, who's the chief information officer, he was a guy from commercial industry. He knew what digital modernization needed to be. The hard part is getting it done in a 900 billion, couple of million person department. That's the really hard work. So these conversations were going on all the time with the big companies. The problem is the technical debt that the department has accrued in 70 years is extraordinarily expensive to correct. And the fact is, it wasn't a digital company at the beginning. This is no different. The previous CNO experiences that in commercial industry, I'm sure, of the time. You got digital companies and you got everybody else. The everybody else finds, the department is not that unique. We all have the same challenges. I think it just requires a commitment of very long-term, flexible funding and just a commitment to go plow away at making this. And the last thing I'll say is our chief technology officer, who I hired into the JAIC, then went to the CIA, just finished there as the CTO. He just is going to, I think he's going to launch a startup himself focusing on this very problem. He now knows, after spending enough time in the government, what he means to say none of this is commercial software best practice. Let me tell you how this has to be done. Nothing about it's going to be easy. Nothing about it's going to be short. Nothing about it's going to be cheap, but it has to be done to make this leap into the future.
One quickie, sorry.
So the tail end of your question asked about potential downside. So you mentioned a couple of examples, 10% cut, U.S. government has a 10% cut in Intel, taking a 15% cut in NVIDIA sales of the PRC. You mentioned the railroads company MP. And so the question I would ask is whether the U.S. government is now picking winners and losers by doing that. And are there small AI companies out there, as an example, that are highly capable, maybe half the price point, that maybe we should consider for some of the problems that we're talking about on this stage today?
The short example I would give is just this gets back to following the money. It's a $900-something billion defense budget. What in urgent need, for example, is $5 to $10 billion in chips for classified compute. And the challenge is who will spend the money on that if you don't have the use case already outlined. And so which service is budgeting for it? Will appropriators in Congress approve it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a dozen of those across the infrastructure that create this sort of the modernization deficit that Lieutenant General Shanahan is talking about. And the prioritizing addressing those, everybody knows is really important, but is never the urgent thing. And so, which makes overcoming that obstacle difficult.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Morning, ma'am. Morning, gentlemen. Midshipman Third Class Sargonar, University of Maryland, Baltimore County. So my question pertains to the countermeasures of AI. So from what I've picked up from this conversation, AI is primarily going to be used for analyzing data and then making decisions for either higher up individuals to enforce or in the long run make decisions autonomously. So with the ability to put up countermeasures, like for example, a heat-seeking missile, you can deploy flares, polluting the information available to the AI. Do you see ways that an AI will get sufficiently powerful enough to see through such distractions? Or do you think a human's always going to have to be somewhat involved with the discernment of information and decision-making process?
So I'll say that there is a lot different with AI than any other technology. What is not different is what the cycle will be from now on. It will be counter, 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 counter. It will happen. I guarantee it will happen. I stood up a red teaming division in the Joint AI Center for this very reason. It was small and wiry. It was 2 people. It wasn't much to it. But we knew the problem we had to go after was our adversaries are dedicated to coming after us. We're going to be dedicated to going after our adversaries. Data corruption. Wendell was getting at this earlier. There are ways you can get into these systems, and it doesn't take much to either poison them, corrupt them, unintentional and intentional. We have to assume the moment we go to war, something has already been put in place by our adversaries to say we're going to make these things fail. Because I would want to do that to theirs as well. So the red teaming piece is extraordinarily important. And you're not going to find everything, but the more you learn about your own defective systems, the more you'll be able to attack your adversaries and shore up your own defenses. Admiral Gilday did this in the cyber world, right? This is nothing new. It's cyber defense, counter defense, and all these other things. But with AI, it is going to get so advanced. I'm a little bit skeptical of some of these papers that say it's actively deceiving and scheming against you. That's anthropomorphic for me. They're still machines. However, they're going to become so advanced, we're going to have to do some extra work figuring out what could these things be capable of not only our adversaries coming after us, but our own machines figuring out how to counter some of the things that we want them to do, but they decide the reward function is achieved in some way that the programmers never accounted for.
I think in some respects, so data integrity is the watchwords there, and not every AI system has to be drawing from a data lake or a data ocean. Maybe it's a data puddle, right, for a specific discrete function like you talked about. And that has to be built into those capabilities and probably segmented and have some type of technology that might be able to sort what's live and what's Memorex, as we used to say. That probably doesn't make any sense to you, but
Thank you for the question. Dr. Haggard.
Thank you, General, and good to see you, Admiral Gilday. I know several people on the panel. I'm going to challenge the title back here. Should maybe the title of this talk be Machine Judgment at Machine Speed for Machine Conflict and Human Judgment at Human Speed for Human Conflict? And what I would offer, and it's great to have a panel with two complex machine organizations of the Air Force, the Navy, and then a human-centric one like the Marine Corps, though I know you've got to. It doesn't part of this, and I know Wendell, I came up to his school years ago with a framework, which I briefed at NSA and retreats for the military and even the Navy on how to frame warfare, but really thinking about three realms of warfare: metaverse, cyberspace, robotic warfare, and then human-centric. And as we know from history, what did Churchill say? Only the admiral at Jutland, I'm forgetting his name, Jellicoe, could lose the war in an afternoon. Meanwhile, trench warfare went on for 4 years. The Battle of the Armada, Drake could win the battle the night when the Spanish, lost the grounding, their anchors, yet the Spanish insurgency went on in the Netherlands for 20 years. That human war takes so long, machine war can overnight be decided. So wouldn't it better to have two sets of ethics, machine, cyber, metaverse, and then protect the complex human questions? So I just offer that as an open question, is maybe we have to have two different sets of this whole discussion.
Is that it's a great question. I wonder how, we have different requirements for different capabilities today, in that the level of reliability associated with systems, what's sort of built into them, the kinds of countermeasures you need to be able to protect against. I mean that almost like in a technical requirements process sense. I guess in some ways the question, and this is sort of consistent with some of the other things I've said, I wonder sometimes whether we make this problem more complicated than we need to, when what we need to do is think about, these are the use cases of AI, these are the requirements that we have for these use cases. The requirements might be different if we're talking about operating in cyberspace versus operating in the physical world, and that's okay. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but that's something that we are fundamentally capable of doing, and we know that we're capable of doing because we've done it with every other capability development kind of thing that we have done. And that essentially, if you strip out the AI and think about it in terms of capabilities and what the requirements are for those capabilities, they'll be different for different uses, and that's okay, and we can do that.
I guess one last thought would be, don't slow up being able to win at Jutland or in the air because we haven't solved the human part, I guess is the...
Yeah, I'd add to what Mike just said, is the way I think about this is the balance between human and smart machine decision-making is never going to be linear. It's going to be very context-dependent. I look at the XY scale or axis, and on one end, cyber defense. Let the machines go. The human's not going to be able to interject fast enough if it looks like it's an existential threat. Nuclear command and control, human, and only humans. He's written about this. I've written about it, talked about it. Somewhere in the middle, it's context-dependent, it's weapon-dependent, it's scenario-dependent, and it's never going to be linear. And I think what we have to do, and it's been said several times already, is spend a lot more time and focus on what do we mean by human-machine integration in this smart machine future, because that's the balance we have to get right. And it's not going to be the traditional human-machine thing where machine does something, human reacts to that. Now it may be machine does something, physically goes and acts on that based on an AI agent, whatever you want to call it. Where's the human role in there? That's the key question. So I think it's going to be very, very fluid, and we don't quite understand that yet because we don't have enough systems out here to try it.
I finished my last book with basically a chapter about maintaining the deployment of technology at a humanly manageable pace. And I think that's what we're confronted with here, is keeping it within a humanly manageable pace. Unfortunately, the hype out there is artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, stuff that does not acknowledge the many forms of human intelligence that we have not even begun to understand how they could be implemented artificially. Wisdom, consciousness, moral intelligence, situational awareness. It's not that these aren't being tackled by machine engineers and so forth. It's just the subtleties that get expressed by humans who have some degree of intelligence and expertise are being overlooked. And it's that we need to keep alive and not buy into the hype.
Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, gentlemen. I am Cadet Second Class Micah Stoidel, a member of the Coast Guard. My question to you is, what do your conversations look like with the Coast Guard? Like, we are a humanitarian service, but we do have some warfighting aspects. And several of you mentioned that you had conversations with all the military services, which the Coast Guard is included.
Oh, I have a very strong relationship with the Coast Guard. Love them. Charlie Epperson, who I think just moved to some new position. We were doing a lot, both in Maven and the Joint AI Center, because there was so much that it was natural for the Coast Guard. HADR, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief. That was our first big project in the Joint AI Center, mostly for wildfires and hurricane relief, but the Coast Guard was equally interested in that. How do you detect... okay, I'll just say it. How do you detect drug boats coming out of somewhere down south? Well, there's potentially technologies that can do that much better than any human could, staring at video screen. So I love the Coast Guard for so many different reasons. One, they didn't have a lot to work with. You're going to find out you're resource limited is a euphemism for you don't have any money, but you have lots of authorities. And the cool part of the authorities is Title 10, other authorities can be used very flexibly depending on the situation. And you're just willing to take these, just like special operations forces were. That's why we went to SOCOM for most of our first one. Just give it to us. We don't have anything. We'll try it out. And it worked really well. So I had really proud of the work that we did with the Coast Guard. They didn't have computer vision experts. They didn't have AI experts. What they had is enthusiasm and a willingness to learn and adapt and say, let's give it a shot. I saw a lot of that down at Key West at the Ops Center down there. So you'll find there is a real thirst for this technology because it's tailor-made for some of the Coast Guard's mission, most of the Coast Guard mission.
They're also a great partner if you really want to kind of broaden who your allies are in some of these spaces.
Yes.
Because our allies,
Yeah.
will talk to you about maritime domain awareness all day long, way before they're going to talk to you about basing,
Yes.
or something like that. So, think Indonesia and other countries that may not otherwise be willing to talk to the United States. But
Yeah, really, Unmanned drove us together down in the Caribbean. In terms of leveraging unmanned platforms like Sail Drone, CEO Admiral Mustin is sitting here in the front row. So it was a mission necessity that drove both services together and understanding how to employ that capability in a way that could really be a force multiplier in how we see things, understand things, and then how we act on that, right? And the Navy and the Coast Guard might act in different ways given our authorities, but the problem set is largely, in terms of how you're gonna frame it, is there's a lot of parallels.
Yeah, if you think about a lot of what like Task Force 59 does in CENTCOM and what related groups have done, that a lot of those capabilities are tailor-made in some ways for the Coast Guard and for what more distributed maritime surveillance looks like.
thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Last question, sir.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
James Buchanan, old sailor, class of 73.
Right.
My question is getting the warfighter to trust an AI system. For instance, the USS Vincennes shot down an airliner in 1988 because they overrode the Aegis combat system. They didn't believe it was attacking. They believed it was attacking them, but it wasn't flying that kind of profile, and they violated the doctrine in the Aegis combat system to shoot it down. So how do we get the warfighters to believe it? I was also, at that time in the 70s, trying to get my skipper to understand that the computer could calculate a CPA, closest point of approach. He did believe it. I had to do it on maneuvering board as well.
I'd love to start with the answer to that question. I stopped using the word trust with talking about AI because some experts convinced me justified confidence was a better word. What do I mean? The difference that you will never believe these things the first time you try. And we deployed some of these Project Maven capabilities to somebody who was already deployed, saw them for the first time, did not like them. That was our job. We're supposed to watch this stuff. So how do you gain confidence? It's over time by doing experiments. Everything that Andy Krepanevich said this morning, experiments, war game, play around with it. What works, what doesn't work. You will not expect somebody to have trust and confidence in a magical thing called AI at first. And it is pretty basic right now, but it's going to get better and better. It's going to require deliberate education and training effort, get exposed to these things as early as possible. If you're a midshipman in this audience, you're probably seeing a lot more than most senior officers in any of the military services right now. It will not happen overnight, and when it goes wrong, people will no longer have confidence in it. They're going to have to regain it. So I'll say what I said earlier. Don't do advanced autonomous weapons systems for the first time in combat. You've got to practice and experiment and war game with these things. And I think it's generational, honestly with you. I think some people will say, well, look, I use ChatGPT every day of my life. Yeah, it's got some things wrong, but it gets most of the stuff cool. And somebody said earlier, our AI coach, well, we're now approaching AI companionship as well. So these things are going to keep advancing pretty quickly. It's going to take a deliberate effort of hands-on experience before we have confidence in them.
I actually believe that a bigger problem for us over time will be making sure that we are constantly validating and verifying that things that we trust are still doing the things we want them to do, to some of the issues that we've heard today about making sure that the humans are still in charge. It's software. At the end of the day, it's software. We have to constantly be in charge of the software. So, all right, folks, thank you very much to the panel. Great discussion. Admiral Spicer, thank you for having us.
Thank you. Fantastic panel. I think you will all agree. I want to thank Midshipman Smith for a great introduction. I want to thank General Reynolds for being a great moderator, and this panel, just phenomenal. And special thanks to Admiral Gilday. So I was talking earlier about the lack of active duty flag and general officers for this conference, and so we had one that was in this panel, and we had to call an audible over the weekend. And you know, a former CNO, 4-star admiral, is not a bad plan B. So thanks, Admiral Gilday, for stepping up.